Hello, everyone, and welcome to Traffic Corner Tuesday. My name is Paul Kerr, one of the Territory Sales Managers at Spack Solutions, and I'll be your host for today's webinar. The City of Edina hired Spack Solutions to develop a presentation to teach elected officials, appointed commissioners, and government staff for what they needed to know how to effectively review a traffic development's impact study. Today, we're going to share the second phase of the Strategic Transportation Planning Method for Developments. If you missed it, our webinar for the first phase was recorded, and you can watch the replay in the member portal at Spack Solutions. Remember, we want you to join the conversation. Mike and Bryant want your feedback on the framework they've developed. Please use the chat box on your screen to ask questions or share your experience throughout the presentation. We hope to have a lively Q&A at the end of the presentation. The Traffic Corner Tuesday webinar series has been brought to you in the past by Mike on Traffic. But we have exciting news to share with you. As we shared last time, we've merged our companies into one entity called Spack Solutions in order to help you to succeed. Spack Solutions provides data collection technologies and transportation system guidance for government staff and their contractors to help them tame congestion and eliminate traffic fatalities. Please check out spacksolutions.com to learn more. Today's presenters are Mike Spack and Brian Fiesick. Mike is the creative force and principal writer of the industry-leading blog, Mike on Traffic. And Bryant is the president of Spack Enterprise and regularly contributes to Mike on Traffic as well as co-hosts the webinars with Mike. Mike and Bryant are both licensed professional engineers and certified professional traffic operations engineer. Together, they have over 40 years of experience in traffic and transportation engineering. So please, let's dive right in.
The next element in our engineering is, so we're moving on from the context down a layer to the second step, big step in the process, and that's the engineering component. And our very first element when we're starting to do our engineering is we like to look at the site plan itself and figure out, are there any red flags? Are there any big issues? Are they, for instance, how's the access connection happening? Are they proposing a driveway that's 50 feet away from a busy intersection and we know it's not gonna work? We need to get that corrected even before we go through the whole study process. We need to talk to the city, we need to talk to the developer, the architect, the civil engineers, whoever's responsible, and just say, that just flat out won't work. We need to go back to the drawing board. So we look at those access connections, and then we also look at the sight lines, which Bryant mentioned. This is really one of those areas that is often overlooked, that everybody on the design team kind of thinks everybody else is doing it, and sometimes it slips through the cracks, but it's too common to go out to a driveway and say, why is that utility box on the corner? I can't see down the oncoming traffic, or why did they put shrubs there, or the monument sign for the development? I mean, there's all kinds of things that can be in the way, but we want to take a look at all those corners to make sure we have clear sight lines, because with bad sight lines, that leads to crash problems. Next on the list is looking at kind of the circulation, the mode conflicts, the queuing within the site. And a great example of this is at gas stations, where depending on where the driveway, how that's aligned with the pumps, how they're aligned with the front door, we can end up, depending how they're laid out, we can minimize those crossing paths or we can maximize them. We can really create problems by having all kinds of weaving around through the site. And we want to make sure if there's the Starbucks on the corner that the drive-through queue isn't stacking out and blocking the entrance for people to come into the development. That can be a big problem. So we want to take a quick look at that. Parking, of course, is a hot button issue. Andrew was just telling us about a development that has parking issues right now. That we want to kind of that Goldilocks. We want to make sure we're providing the right amount of parking, just not too much, but not too little. So we want to take a quick look at that to see if there's big red flags. And next is the loading zones of where are we putting the trash dumpsters for the development. Where's Amazon or UPS or at a grocery store, where are the big semi-trucks? Is that put around the back side of the building, or are they coming to the front side and blocking the front doors? That can be a problem. And then MAAS is mobility as a service, and so that's Uber, Lyft, and this is a hot button issue that we've been very forthright in making sure we address in our studies, but this is one of those areas where other consultants are just not addressing that. But anyone who lives in a denser city has dealt with, why is this car stopping right in front of me on the road? Oh wait, it's an Uber letting somebody out or picking up. And we are figuring out how to better incorporate that into the development so they have a place to pull over. And last, we certainly want to know if the city's received any requests. Do they have any complaints in the area? Speeds in the neighborhood right adjacent to the development? Are there people saying, hey, this is an unsafe intersection? Whatever that background that consultants don't necessarily get, but that the city engineer, the assistant city engineer, the planners, what are they hearing? We want to know about those issues. We don't want to be surprised in front of the city council at a public hearing.
Exactly. And so like Mike was saying too, this is all stuff that we can do very quickly and upfront before we get into the meat of the study. And we want to do that. And why we've titled it Red Flag is because this is the stuff that should raise that red flag and say we need to get this solved now, because if we take our typical 4 to 6 weeks and we don't bring it up for a month, well, now all this other planning has happened, and we need to get it solved initially. So it's just very important to take that initial look and use our expertise, use your consultant's expertise to say, is there anything wrong that we need to rethink before we get too far down the line?
And this is definitely one of those best practices that not every consultant does this. They just, we've seen some consultants just, here's your study, by the way, your driveway shouldn't be there.
Yeah.
Well, waiting 8 weeks to give that bad news is just not good for anyone.
So on to our next engineering part, traffic forecasting. So this is specifically looking at cars when we're going through and we're trying to figure out how much traffic is going to go through with this new development. And so we will look at the trip, what we call the trip and parking generation.
Jargon alert.
Exactly. So trip is just referring to one movement from some place to another. So from your house to your work is one trip. From your work to the grocery store would be one trip. So all those things represent a trip, and we're trying to establish how many of them we expect for this particular development. So the first part of this is ITE, more jargon, Institute of Transportation Engineers. Yeah. They have put together a large study of lots of land uses, hundreds of land uses, and they've put typical traffic for these land uses. So you can go, you can look it up and say, if this is a housing development, we know about how much housing that would be. So they are a great source. It is a national source. It is used all over the place. Best practice is the local, and this is what we do, where if we have a particular fast food that's coming in, we will want to go out and collect at other fast foods. So how much traffic is that fast food specifically generating? If we can grab 2 or 3 of them, we can come in with a much better estimate of traffic than ITE can.
And the data set that ITE has is volunteer driven, so we submit our data, and actually Spack Solutions is very proud. We are the largest private donator in this last round. right behind Toronto,
Yes.
of data into that data set that then other engineers around the country and North America can use. But it's important to say that data set is not really a living document. It gets updated about every 10 years, and it has...
They're trying to get a little better, but it's not dynamic.
Right, so we very much want to get local and current data trends, and we'll be talking about how that comes into play.
Yes, I mean, and a big part of it is we have different driving habits than Florida, than California, than Iowa even. So we want to make sure if we get local, again, best practices, if we get that local data, we are accounting for our local driving habits. So now we'll get into some more jargon about the trip and parking generation. Internal, this is referring to trips within a site. So on developments that have multiple little strip mall spots and other places, there might be several things you go to. And a grocery store might be a good example where sometimes they will have a fast food in their parking lot. And so you stop at the grocery store, you pick up your groceries, and don't want to cook, you stop at the fast food. You are internal to that site, so even though you have gone to each of those developments, and there are technically 2 trips, it doesn't impact the public road. So we want to account for that internal and make sure we're not overestimating how much traffic is through a site. Pass by is a similar one, and this refers to someone who's driving by today. They're on the road, it's their typical path from home to work and back. Now this new development comes in and they're driving along and say, hey, I want to stop here. So it is not a new trip on that road. They were already there to begin with, but they are taking a turn into the development, wherever their access happens to be, and taking that turn out later. So we want to account for that and make sure that we note there is action at the driveways, but not necessarily an increase on the public road. TDM reductions, we keep throwing a lot of jargon out at you here. TDM is travel demand management. And what we want to do on this one is recognize that if you have strategies in place, you can actually reduce your traffic. And this can be as simple as allowing people to work from home on occasion. Industry will shift their hours so that the main shift of workers is not coming during the peaks, and there are various other strategies that can be employed, and if we are looking at a site, we will want to know what that development is doing, which might reduce traffic. So again, all these are trying to get to a realistic view of what is going to happen at this site. This is a little nuanced one on this bullet here of peak generator versus peak hour of adjacent street. And when we look at a particular land use, its generation can often be different than what happens during your typical commuter hours. So a church would be a good example. They're going to have a peak on Wednesday night, and on Sundays they're not going to have much during the typical commuter hours. So we would look at probably both. What happens during those commuter peak hours, what happens during the peak generation. School is another great example that's typically combined in the morning. Commuter, school starts, overlap, but then as you get into the afternoon, school lets out earlier while the commuter is after. And so for our school studies, we will look at all 3 to see what happens during those different hours.
So in that example, the peak hour of the morning generator is the same as the peak hour of the adjacent street. When we get into school letting out at 3 p.m., that is the peak hour of the generator. But then we will also look at rush hour between 4 and 6 p.m. That is the peak hour of the adjacent street. And that's when staff is going home and the kids playing sports, their practices are letting out. Not as much traffic as the peak hour of the generator at 3 o'clock, but we still need to account for both.
And our last one is maximum allowed use. And this is, again, best practice. What we think puts development into context is figuring out what could happen on that site. So if they are proposing a retail of a certain size, it might not be what that site can actually hold. It might be 80,000 square feet, whereas the site could actually hold 100,000 square feet. And so we want to show that difference to say, look, they're proposing this, which is actually slightly less traffic than they could. Or if we compare it to what a business might be, an office or a residential development. So depending on what is allowed by zoning, having this comparison can put it into context for people and say they're proposing this, which has a certain amount of traffic, as compared to what they could be proposing and that associated traffic. So what we have on the screen here are just some typical round numbers for different types of land use based on ITE, Institute of Transportation Engineers, their last trip generation report. And these are just good numbers that we try to remember as transportation engineers. Most of them I've got off the top of my head. But it's something that you can roll out, you can easily do some calculations, and as you're looking at it, you can try to put things in context. So, for example, a single family, there's about 10 trips a day. So 5 leaving, 5 coming back. We assume everybody's going to come back to their house.
Yes.
But during a peak hour, there's only 1 trip. So if you have a development that is proposing 20 homes, you're going to have about 200 trips over the course of an average day. You're going to have about 20 during that peak hour. So just some simple math that you can do to try to put things in context.
Yes. And another important part of the traffic forecasting is after we have calculated how much traffic we think is going to be generated by the development, it's where is that traffic coming from going to? And so here, the little purple building, we have spread out on the highway, we expect a quarter of the traffic to come from the north, a quarter of the traffic to come from the south, and we have the other county roads at the site. And this is how we route that traffic in and then back out of the development, is multiplying these ratios by the trip generation. This is an area that most folks in the profession don't talk very much about, but this is really, really, really key to the whole overall study. And if the number on the north was 50% instead of 25%, that very much could be the difference between needing a traffic signal at a key intersection or not needing a traffic signal. And so we like to hone in on these percentages by looking at the context of the area, how busy are the roads. That gives us an indication where people are coming from going to. Mm-hmm. If it's a school and we can get the zip codes of where those kids are coming from going to, we will use that to get these ratios. If it is a Target store coming in, we will look at where the other Targets and Walmarts and any competing businesses. If we're on the south end of a metro area and there's a couple of other stores just to the north, well, we know that the traffic is going to be slanted to the south. It's going to be weighted to the south. So we're looking at those travel sheds. We would love to be able to get it, but it often is considered proprietary, confidential data from the owner. Like if a Starbucks is going in, Starbucks has a very good idea of their demographics and where they expect folks to go. But they don't want that in our traffic studies that then Caribou Coffee can figure out that data as well. So they consider that proprietary. But if a user is willing to share that data, we love to use that as a starting point too. So this is not exactly hardcore science. There's interpretation here, and
a little bit of art.
Yeah, a little bit of art, and the city staff should really be looking at this closely every time they get a new study and saying, does that make sense based on what I know of this area? And this is a role where you as city council members and planning commissioners or on the transportation commission, this is an area where you should raise your hand and say, you know what, that just doesn't make sense to me. So this is one area.
Have them justify their numbers,
Yes.
different things like that. You can always raise that question, and
Yes.
whoever has done the study should have an answer for you.
Yes.
So the previous two really talked about the site development itself, how we generate traffic for that site, and how we get it onto the roadway system. The next part is looking at around it, and we talked a little bit about this before of wanting to know what other development is in the area. And so as we put together our forecast, the two final things we look at is just a general background increase. So over time, traffic has generally increased. We know that, we measured it, And so you can look back and see in this particular area, traffic has generally grown X% a year, so we're going to apply some percentage to the roads to reflect that, keeping in mind that your site also applies to that growth. So it may not be an exact one-to-one comparison. But just in general, there is regional development. We want to account for it. If you are in a downtown area, for instance, Minneapolis, St. Paul, that growth is going to be almost nothing. I mean, they're built up areas. They are actively trying to reduce their traffic as opposed to grow it, so there may not be this increase. In a suburb, you probably will have some sort of increase. In a fast growing, it could be very high. The second part of this is what we requested earlier, is specific developments. So as Mike said earlier, the Walmart down the street, if that's been approved and is being constructed, we want to make sure we're accounting for that traffic through our study intersections as well. And so taking all three of those pieces together is how we get our forecast, and now we know what that future traffic through our study area is going to be.
And typically we will be forecasting out into the future, that we will start with maybe a year after the development is built and assumed to be fully functioning. The bigger the development, the further into the future we're going to look. That just looking at right after it opens is fine for a small to medium-sized development, but if we're looking at the Mall of America, we want to be planning freeway interchanges out 20 years. We want to make sure that things are, in the long run, really being addressed.
Exactly.
So we're moving on. The last phase of engineering is actually doing the analysis, the engineering calculations. And at the heart of this is more jargon and a little bit confusing. We call it level of service, and this concept has been around in our industry for about 60 years now, 60, 70 years, and it gives a graded scale to an intersections operation or a roadway corridors operation. And the tricky thing about this is that it's letter grades from A, B, C, D, E, F, and it's based on how much folks wait at that intersection to go through it. So how much are they delayed getting through that intersection? And it's on average over the peak hour, the rush hour. And there's a gradation level here. There's two different scenarios. There's one on the right for the signalized intersections. And the theory here is that people have more patience at a traffic signal because they believe the traffic signal is going to change. People are less patient at stop signs or roundabouts, which are unsignalized intersections on the left. So the amount of delay we consider acceptable is different based on the traffic control. And I want to go through a couple of these gradations. That here on the right we have level of service A, almost no traffic. At the same this would probably be midday, or very much would look like at 2 in the morning, although that would probably be a darked out image. But then as we go up the scale, we get busier at level of service C. We obviously get busier at level of service D, but much different than your children's schooling and art schooling. Level of service D during the peak hour is considered acceptable in most areas. Some areas you may decide to draw the line at between the C and D boundary. Other areas may say between the E and the F boundary in Los Angeles or Atlanta. So this is context that we need to get up front, that the traffic engineer consultant shouldn't be telling you what's acceptable. You should have that as part of your ground rules.
Absolutely.
But then we tip into over congested as we go up the scale into level service F. But we want to say that a thriving community has traffic and has a level of congestion. That if you are a ghost town, if you're in certain neighborhoods of Detroit, you have level of service A because you have boarded up buildings and you have no traffic. But think about all of the areas that folks like to go to restaurants, or when you're on vacation, the areas you like to go down in Miami or whatever it may be. They are thriving, busy areas. They have a level of congestion. So then going to the next slide, and this is our best practice, is we look at each intersection. So we're showing 3 different intersections here, and we're looking at the gray bars being the existing, the kind of teal bars being what it's going to look like in a year or two if this wasn't built out, the development. Then we layer on, if we add on our development traffic, what that's going to look like. We draw the line at, the red line there is the unacceptable line, and in Edina here, it is at that level of service DE boundary, so that's 55 seconds at a traffic signal. But there's actually an optimal band, that this green band, if it's operating with 0 delay at level of service A during rush hour, that means we overbuilt the intersection and we have too much infrastructure out there. If it's anything more than just a stop sign and a road going 2 directions.
2-lane roads, yeah.
So to optimize your infrastructure investments, we actually want to be in that level C to D area. That's a key point.
And so this graph refers to signalized intersections, and this is the way we try to present things. Rather than the A, B, C, D, rather than that letter scale, we put it in this way with the clear red line with the band on it, trying to identify what we think is optimal, more of a pass-fail as opposed to the letter grade, which can get confusing for the public and other people.
And this is a best practice. Some consultants will give you a giant eye chart of all of these scenarios, and you have to try to decipher what's good and bad in this big matrix of letters or seconds of delay numbers.
So secondary to this, if this is our signalized, obviously we need one for unsignalized, and we have this graph, which is slightly different than the other one that we presented. So the other one was based on delay, and for this as a stop sign, a side street stop, so you're coming up to the stop sign, your cross street traffic can free flow, so you're looking for that gap. When we look at those intersections, we want to look at how much stacking is at that stop sign, not how much delay there is, because overall for those types of intersections, if the main road doesn't have to stop, that's 0 delay, so it completely skews your results.
Right, and if there's one car during rush hour trying to stop at that stop sign, even if they have to wait 8 minutes, we're not going to stop 1,000 cars going back and forth to let the one car out. We're going to have to deal with that a different way than putting in a traffic signal or a roundabout for them. But as Bryant was alluding to, it's how much stacking is happening at that peak moment during rush hour. That's what we're really honing in on.
And so for this table or chart here, as we look at our green line on there, that represents 5 cars stacked at a stop sign. And based on our experience and what we've been looking at, if you have 5 cars at any given time or less, your intersection is fine. You don't need to think about improvements as that. Even if there's some longer delays for them to get through, that means either there's not a lot of traffic or they're spaced out well enough. It's just there's not enough to invest your limited resources into improving it if that's what your stacking looks like. Similarly then, on the top line, the red line, that represents 10 vehicles. So if you have 10, 12 more vehicles stacked at this stop sign, now that is definitely a clear line of you need action. We should be doing something here. Should we be thinking about a turn lane to spread that traffic out? Should we be thinking about different traffic control? Lots of different things you can think about, but it's a clear line of action that says if we've got this many vehicles stacked, let's do something about it.
And then obviously between 5 and 10 vehicles, we're in the kind of judgment area and thinking about it, and this may go into more of the long-range plans to watch it for the city, but maybe not build something immediately for that development. And again, just like the level of service, are you setting your standard at the D or E boundary? We believe every community should talk through and actively make the decision. Maybe in your community, 4 cars is the line, or maybe 15 cars is the line on the maximum end. But you should work on that. But based on our experience and our study, these are the tipping points for us.
As the last part of the analysis, we are doing a lot with computer models, and what we always like to say is if you put garbage in, you're going to get garbage out. And so our highly technical term of level of service shenanigans, these are things that we always look for. We try to make sure we're paying attention as we're going through our model to make sure the model reflects what's out there today and then accurately reflects what will happen in the future. So these are technical terms. Most people will probably never need to look at these. They happen in the background, but they are very important and they can change the results of your analysis. So the first one is the peak hour factor, which represents the flow of traffic over the hour. And so if we look at our peak hour, if we have 1,000 cars, are they nicely spaced throughout that whole peak hour? There's no up and down, it's just very consistent. Or is it a school where there is 15 minutes that is crazy because everybody's coming to pick up their kid, and then the rest of the hour it's gone? That is what the peak hour factor refers to, and again, very important for schools, religious organizations, that everybody comes at once, movie theaters. There are various land uses that have a set start time that everyone is going to arrive in that 15 minutes before the start.
Yeah, manufacturing facilities that actually work on 8-hour shifts, etc.
Heavy trucks, this refers to those larger trucks, semi-trailers, and how many are going through important industrial areas. You want to make sure you get that truck percentage right. For your queuing, obviously a truck takes up a lot more room than a personal vehicle, and this factor can play into that in making sure are your turn lanes long enough to accommodate them. Similarly, if they're at a stop sign, those larger trucks take a longer time to get started. You need to make sure you have a good gap for them to get through. So very important factor in our analysis. Last one is lane balance, and if you have, say, dual left turns, sometimes they are not used equally, because right after the left turn there's a freeway entrance and everybody wants to take a right onto the freeway entrance. So you can envision it, you're taking a left and an immediate right. Well, most people are going to stack in one of those lanes because they don't have a chance to weave over to get where they want to go. So you can have a very different feel of traffic and not this even flow through the lanes, and that can happen on through lanes as well. You need to pay attention to that, and gets back to our site recon and what we've seen out there of how that balancing occurs.
Next up is kind of a quality control check, just a gut feel for us that mostly we're looking at the intersections and the driveway intersections. Those are kind of those pinch points, but we also want to look at the corridor as a whole. And we think of them kind of as a bucket, and that bucket has so much capacity and we don't want it overflowing. We don't want to overfill that bucket. And so here are different configurations of roads, and kind of at that D to E boundary, getting congested level, just a quick quality control check on our numbers. And by doing the 48-hour turning movement counts, we actually can do the math to just get what is the volume at that point on the corridor downstream from the intersection. So that's another reason we love video cameras, is it gets us this data with no extra cost. But one point in here is that kind of the couple middle ones, the 3-lane road where you have a 2-way left turn lane down the middle, or just left turn lanes down the middle, it actually has very similar capacity to a 4-lane undivided road without turn lanes. And that 4-lane undivided road is the least safe, statistically, well proven, across the country. So there's ample opportunity whenever we see a 4-lane undivided roadway, at least a flag. The city should think about long-term convert that to a 3-lane when it is next reconstructed, or do you want to restripe it, repaint that, and use that extra width for bike lanes and shorten up the crosswalks. And there's lots of benefits there, but that's just one of the nuances in this chart.
Mm-hmm. And it is also important to remember that these are planning level, so we use them as a gauge, like Mike said, but there are roads that handle more than these There are roads that cannot handle this much based on what's going on, but it's just a way for us, again, that best practice, quick look at a road, is it appropriate for what's out there?
Okay, and that wraps up part 2. Sorry, guys. Okay, so that wraps up part 2. So thank you. We know we went a little bit longer, so we're going to go forward with the Q&A to be a little bit longer. If you need to drop off, we understand. So first question coming in for Mike and Brian. With 10 vehicles waiting at a stop sign, you suggest an improvement. Is this just at peak hour, or is this throughout the day?
That would be the peak queue, which typically would happen during the peak hour. There is context, and this is a gray area that definitely needs professional judgment involved to look at it. It is not a number we can give to a computer and spit out an answer. But it is generally in the peak hour is when that maximum queue is typically going to happen. But of course, if you're dealing with the church on Sunday morning, maybe we need to put traffic cops out there or something else and look at a different solution.
Yeah, it's more what your answer is as opposed to the exact when it happens. So if it happens, you need to do something. What are you going to do about it? And there's a whole host of answers that come with that. So that's really what we'd be looking at.
Once again, I want to thank everyone for sticking around. Again, if you have more questions, comments about what you saw, go ahead and put them through. I have a particular question for you guys on this, if I may.
Yes.
So when putting this together and doing a presentation like this, I understand that it's important to kind of know, what the difference is of like Edina versus, as you said in the webinar, it's all dependent on if it's local and what the information you have. What are some of the more varying degrees of some of the things that you see versus maybe some of the more similar? I guess let's get to that. What are some of the more, is there a similar theme that you see when you're setting up these traffic studies that you tend to go, okay, we know we have to do X, Y, Z, but we don't know A, B, C?
It's a very broad question. We know we're going to get into the background of stuff. If I'm just thinking through what we just presented, the different reports we have in there and what we're looking at, we know we're going to get into the background, what's out there. We're going to do observations on stuff. We know we're going to analyze different intersections. I mean, those are all basic things that need to be done as part of the study. Where our presentation, where our stuff has gone, is trying to take it one step further. So there's a basic level, and we tried to layer on to really get valuable information on top of it, which can mean doing the daily check as well as the peak hour checks, combining those two things together. Sight distance is something that isn't examined often enough from our view. And so putting that in, it may not be required anywhere. At least I don't know that I've seen it required in too many places, but it's a good thing to do, and we highly recommend it.
Yeah, what we're trying to do is move away from traffic studies being done just to be able to check a box on an application permit. We want to work on projects that are adding value. And if they're not adding value, we don't want to work on them.
Right.
The scoping of a traffic study, or we're going to strategic transportation plans, the scoping is pretty consistent in our experience across the United States. Where there's differences is, I talked about it in the video of, is our standard level of C, D, is it E, is it level of service D or better at every movement, at every intersection? Those standards of what is considered acceptable and unacceptable, different communities draw that line differently. So that's where we see the real variance is more on what the standards are.
I would also add to that there can be a variance in terms of when the traffic study is even needed. And some of them draw the line differently. You may have to do one for anything. They just automatically have to do it, or There may be the varying degrees of if your trip generation is this, or if there's some mitigating factors, then you need it, an if-then statement. So that's another thing to look at, is when it's required for each individual agency.
Is it better to practice? Is it better practice to set a study area based on the standard peak hours, AM or PM, or the peak hours of the generator?
Development specific, in my view. What are you examining? And I'll take schools as the example, which has the morning peak lines up with the typical commuter AM peak. So we would definitely study that. The afternoon is where you have that variance. Schools get out earlier than most people leave work, so that's where you get the split there. When we look at schools, we will often do all three and just try to capture all of them. So we are capturing both the typical AM and PM as well as the peak of the generator, in this case, the school peak, the afternoon school peak.
And we typically then also, so which peak hours you're studying is one component, then also which intersections, how far away you're going, and then also how many scenarios into the future you're forecasting. Those are all dependent on the trip generation of the development. And typically we will look at the peak. So whether that's usually the peak hour of the generator. Offices, same as normal rush hour. School is different. But typically we scope out the intersections, the study hours, the scenario years, all of the components are based on the peak hour of the generator. But again, there is room for judgment in there.
Which is a good reason to go talk with the agency who oversees it to make sure you're capturing what they want. And if you think you need to capture a Saturday afternoon, and they may agree with you, or they say, you know what, we're not worried about that. We just want you to do the typical AM and PM. So it's always good to talk with the agency.
It's also, as professionals, I always want us to keep in mind, what are we trying to accomplish with our study? And what we're trying to do is figure out where the system has the potential to break down and where we might have to do something about that. So that's the lens to always ask the question. So it's not always just an algorithm that leads to an answer and you don't think about it once you have the numerical answer. It's what are we trying to accomplish with this study?
Crafty engineering judgment.
Okay. All right. We're just going to give people, I know they just got done watching the video, maybe give them a few more minutes to come up with some questions.
Sure. Well, yeah. And so next month, we're going to do part 3 of this, where we get into the analysis and recommendations coming out of the engineering portion. So we'll be covering more of those topics, and also a little teaser of we are building the system at spacksolutions.com to be able to provide the continuing education credits. And once this 3-part series is done, we will definitely have that up and running so you can take the quizzes and get certificates. And it'll even keep the history there inside that member portal of which quizzes you have taken and passed. So look for that coming next month. And there we have it. So happy holidays, everyone. Hope you had a great year and look forward to seeing you next year.
Yeah, thanks for tuning in, everyone, and hope to see you next month as well.
Thank you, everyone, for coming to the webinar. And remember, if you do have questions that come up later, you can always email Mike.
Yes.
So thank you guys once again.